The first sound was the whine of a two-stroke engine at 6:42 in the morning. It was a Tuesday. I remember the time because the digital clock on my coffee maker flashed it at me as I poured my first cup. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the distant hum of the grounds crew on the golf course or the growl of a delivery truck gearing down on the main road. This was close. It was a high-pitched, angry sound, the sound of teeth chewing through wood. It was the sound of a chainsaw. I walked to the large bay window in my study, the one that overlooked the back 40 acres of my property. My land is an anomaly in this meticulously planned community, a parcel of old forest and meadow that was grandfathered in when the development was built around it. My house sits on the front 10 acres, but the back 40 is a private nature preserve, a quiet legacy left to me by my wife, Eleanor. The centerpiece of that legacy was a stand of 40 towering longleaf pines, each over a century old, that formed a dense, dark green wall at the far end of the meadow, marking the true boundary of my property. They were the reason we bought this land, and that is where the sound was coming from. Through the morning mist, I could see them. A crew of 3 men in bright orange vests were systematically felling my trees. Not trimming, not pruning, felling. The sight was so fundamentally wrong, so profoundly violating, that for a moment my mind refused to process it. It was like seeing the sky turn green. You know it's impossible, and yet there it is. Beside the work truck, arms crossed, stood Carol Matheson. She was the president of our homeowners association. She was pointing at another one of the pines, directing the man with the saw. She was on my land. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked back to the kitchen, set down my coffee mug, and picked up my phone. I opened the camera app, set it to record video, and walked out the back door, across the dew-wet grass of the meadow. The air was cool and smelled of pine resin and exhaust fumes, a scent of sacrilege. As I got closer, the noise was deafening, a roar that vibrated in my chest. I saw one of the giants creak, groan, and then surrender, crashing to the earth with a ground-shaking thud that felt like a punch to the gut. 18 of them were already down. 18. I stopped about 20 feet from Carol. My phone held steady, the red recording light a small, accusatory eye. She saw me and her face, usually arranged in a mask of pleasant, condescending authority, tightened. She marched toward me, her expensive walking shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth of my meadow. "Arthur," she said, her voice straining to be heard over the saw that had just started on a new tree. "Good, you're here. We're taking care of this fire hazard for you. You should have received the notice." I said nothing. I just kept the camera on her. The silence unnerved her. She was a woman who thrived on verbal engagement, on arguments she could win through sheer volume and rhetorical gymnastics. Silence was a vacuum she had to fill. "The board voted unanimously," she continued, raising her voice. "These trees are a clear violation of the new fire safety ordinance. They're overgrown, a tinderbox waiting to happen. We're acting under Article 7, Section 4 of the bylaws, which allows the Architectural Control Committee to remove any landscape element deemed a danger to the community. You'll be billed for the service, of course. It's for the good of the whole neighborhood." She was performing not for me, but for the tree crew, for the unseen audience of neighbors she imagined, were peering out their windows, grateful for her proactive leadership. She was asserting her dominance, her right to stand on my land and destroy my property. I lowered the phone slightly, just enough so she could see my face was calm, impassive. "Carol," I said, my voice quiet but clear in a brief lull as one saw shut off. "Get off my property." Her eyes flashed. This was not the reaction she expected. She expected pleading, anger, a fight. She was prepared for a fight. She was not prepared for a quiet, simple instruction. "I will not. We are conducting official HOA business. If you interfere, I will call the sheriff. We will have you fined for obstruction." She took a step closer, invading my personal space. "This is for the community, Arthur. Your selfish attachment to these messy, dangerous trees is not more important than the safety of our homes or our views." Ah, there it was. The last 2 words, or our views. She said it almost as an afterthought, a slip of the tongue, but it was the entire truth. I raised the phone again, making sure it was pointed directly at her face. I didn't speak, I just recorded. She stared at me for a long moment, the condescension in her eyes curdling into pure malice. She had expected a feeble old man, a pushover she could bully like she bullied so many others. She had no idea who I was. She had no idea what my life's work had been. She had no idea that for the past 2 years I had been documenting her every move, every petty fine, every abuse of power. She had no idea that in her arrogant, self-assured pronouncement, standing amidst the carnage of my trees, she had just handed me a signed, notarized, and delivered confession. She had no idea that this was not the end of a conflict, but the beginning of a process. A very, very methodical process. But before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain. People in the neighborhood saw me as a quiet man, a widower who kept to himself. They were not wrong. My wife, Eleanor, passed away 5 years ago. We had bought this plot of land 30 years prior, a sprawling 50-acre parcel of undeveloped woodland just outside the city. We built our house ourselves, not with our own hands, but with our own plans. She was an architect, and I am a structural engineer. Our home was our combined thesis, a testament to our life together, built of steel, glass, and stone, designed to blend with the landscape, not dominate it. My specialty for 45 years was telecommunications infrastructure. Specifically, I designed and oversaw the construction of broadcast and cellular towers, monstrous, complex, steel lattice structures that people hate to look at but can't live without. My job was not about aesthetics. It was about physics, about metallurgy, about zoning laws, about FAA regulations, about easements, about soil mechanics, about load paths, and about thousands upon thousands of pages of documentation. I spent my life in a world of verifiable facts, of blueprints and contracts, where every claim had to be backed by a calculation, a survey, or a statute. In my world, you couldn't just say a thing was true. You had to prove it, on paper. When Eleanor died, the house became very quiet. The woods became my solace. The longleaf pines in particular were her cathedral. She would walk among them every morning. She knew each one. She'd point out the way the light filtered through their needles, the patterns of the bark, the red-cockaded woodpeckers that nested high in the oldest trunks. They weren't just trees to us. They were landmarks of our life. They were living, breathing structures that had stood on that ridge for longer than the United States had been a country. They were, in the most literal sense, irreplaceable. Then about 8 years ago, the development came. A high-end, gated community called Eagle's Crest. They bought up all the surrounding farmland and began building enormous houses on quarter-acre lots. Our 50 acres were a hole in their master plan, and they tried to buy us out repeatedly. We always refused. So they built around us. Our long driveway became a private road off one of their cul-de-sacs. By a strange quirk of the county platting, our property was technically included within the geographic boundaries of the HOA, but with a laundry list of exemptions. We were not required to follow their architectural guidelines, their landscaping rules, or their color palettes. We were an island of old woods in their sea of manicured lawns and beige stucco. For years it was fine. The neighbors were distant but polite. Then, 2 years ago, Carol Matheson and her husband moved in. They bought the largest house in the development, a monstrosity on the ridge directly behind my property. And from their sprawling back deck, their prized $1 million mountain view was filtered through the dense green canopy of my century-old longleaf pines. Carol wasted no time in her conquest of the community. She saw the HOA not as a tool for community maintenance, but as a vehicle for her own ambition. She got herself elected president within 6 months, and then the notices started. Mr. Henderson next door was fined $200 because his garden hose was not in a designated coiled position. The family across the street got a violation for a child's bicycle left on the driveway overnight. She implemented a new rule requiring all trash receptacles to be a specific proprietary shade of taupe, available only from a company owned by her brother-in-law. I watched all of this quietly. When my first notice arrived, a $50 fine for unmanaged natural growth referring to the wildflowers in my meadow, I paid it. I didn't argue. I didn't complain. I simply wrote the check, made a photocopy of it and the notice, and placed them in a new file folder. It was a simple manila folder, but it would become the most important character in this story. On the tab I wrote simply, HOA. I kept the receipts. Every single one. Over the next 2 years the folder grew thick. A fine for the dilapidated state of my gravel driveway. A notice about the unapproved color of my front door, which had been the same forest green for 30 years. A warning about the height of the grass in the meadow, which I intentionally kept long for the ground-nesting birds Eleanor had loved. I paid every fine without protest. Each payment was a transaction. Each canceled check was a piece of evidence. It was a quiet, methodical process of discovery. I was letting her build my case for me. Her obsession with my pines began as a series of passive-aggressive comments at the community mailbox. "Such a shame those overgrown trees block the sunset," she'd say. Then came the formal, but still indirect, approaches. An HOA newsletter article about the importance of maintaining clear vistas to enhance property values. Then, a friendly visit from a landscaper, her cousin, I later learned, offering a free consultation on how to thin out my wooded areas. I politely declined. She had no idea that my politeness was not weakness, it was strategy. My entire professional life had been spent dealing with contentious zoning boards, angry neighborhood groups, and local governments who saw my towers as eyesores. I learned long ago that arguing was pointless. Emotion was a liability. The only thing that mattered was the file, the survey, the statute, the paper, the truth, documented and undeniable. Carol's world was built on performance, on social pressure, on her own subjective sense of what was right. My world was built on bedrock and steel, on things you could measure and verify. Her attack on my trees was the moment those two worlds collided. The last of the 22 pines had fallen by the time I walked back to my house. The silence that followed the chainsaws was more profound, more shocking than the noise itself. It was a dead silence, a void where a living presence had been. I went back to my study. I took a photo of the thick manila folder labeled HOA. I emailed it to my lawyer, a man named Ben Carter, who had handled all my corporate contracts for 30 years. The subject line was simple: "It's time." Then I attached the video I had just taken of Carol Matheson, standing on my property, admitting her motive. The body of the email contained only 5 words: "I am ready to work." My first step was not emotional, it was procedural. I had to formally establish the facts of the case, even though they were obvious to me. The day after the trees were cut down, I made a call to David Chen, a man I'd worked with for decades. David was a licensed land surveyor, one of the best in the state. His work was his art, a symphony of precision and legal exactitude. "David," I said when he answered, "it's Arthur. I have a job for you, a rush job." I explained the situation. He was quiet for a moment. He knew about Eleanor and her love for those woods. "Timber trespass with a side of HOA nonsense," he said, his voice tight with professional anger. "Arthur, I'll be there tomorrow at dawn." True to his word, David and his crew arrived at 6 a.m. the next morning. I watched from the window as they set up their tripods and total stations. It was a ballet of quiet competence. They weren't just marking the property line. They were creating a legally unimpeachable document. They located the original iron survey pins from the 1920s, buried deep in the soil. They measured the exact diameter of every single stump. They triangulated the position of each fallen tree, proving beyond any doubt that they had stood not near the property line, but hundreds of feet inside it. They documented the deep ruts the tree company's heavy equipment had carved into my meadow. While David worked, I moved on to my next task. I needed a certified arborist, not a landscaper, not a tree trimmer, but a forensic specialist in trees. I found one from the state university, a woman with a doctorate in forestry who specialized in valuing heritage trees for litigation. Dr. Annabelle Reed arrived that afternoon. She spent 4 hours walking the site of the destruction. She took core samples from the stumps to verify their age. She photographed the growth rings, the massive root balls ripped from the earth. She documented the nesting cavities of the woodpeckers. She was as methodical as I was, her work a quiet accumulation of irrefutable data. The next morning, I sent the first formal warning. It was not an angry letter. It was a cold, precise legal document drafted by Ben. It was sent via certified mail, with signature required, to Carol Matheson personally, and to each member of the HOA board. The letter was simple. It stated that the HOA had illegally entered my property and destroyed 42 longleaf pines. It included a copy of the original property deed from 1988 and the newly completed survey map from David, with the locations of the stumps clearly marked. It informed them that they were to cease and desist any further entry onto my property. It also included a notice of claim, informing them that we would be seeking damages for the value of the destroyed timber, the cost of remediation, and punitive damages for willful trespass. Carol's response was predictable. She refused to sign for the letter. The postal worker left a notice in her mailbox. She ignored it. After a week, the letter was returned to my lawyer's office, stamped unclaimed. This, of course, was not a victory for her. In the eyes of the law, refusal to accept a certified letter is often treated as acknowledgement of receipt. She was building my case for me, one foolish mistake at a time. I kept the receipt. She did, however, respond via email, not to my lawyer, but directly to me. It was a masterpiece of arrogant dismissal. "Arthur," it began, "I have received your little note. Please be advised that the HOA stands by its decision. Your property is a fire risk, and we acted in the best interests of the community. The survey you provided is irrelevant. We have our own documentation. We consider the matter closed. Please remit payment for the tree removal service $18,500 within 30 days to avoid a lien being placed on your property." Her mention of our own documentation was the key. She was claiming to have a professional assessment that justified her actions. I knew it had to be a lie, but I needed to prove it. On paper, Ben filed a formal request with the HOA, as was my right as a member, for any and all reports, meeting minutes, and expert opinions related to the decision to remove the trees on my property. This was the point where a reasonable person would have paused, consulted a lawyer, and realized the immense legal and financial jeopardy they were in. Carol Matheson was not a reasonable person. She doubled down. A week later, a package arrived from the HOA's management company. Inside was a single document. It was a 2-page fire safety assessment for my property. It was dated 3 weeks prior to the cutting. It was filled with vague, unscientific language about excessive fuel load and dangerous canopy density. It concluded that the 42 pines represented an imminent and severe fire threat and recommended their immediate removal. The report was signed by a certified landscape and fire mitigation specialist. The name was Mark Gable. I recognized the last name. It was Carol's maiden name. A quick search confirmed it. Mark Gable was her cousin, a man who owned a lawn mowing and shrub trimming service in the next county. His professional certification was from an online course that took 6 hours to complete. This was the bombshell. This was the fraud at the heart of her entire justification. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had conspired to create a fraudulent document to provide cover for her act of vandalism. She had no idea that I would check. She assumed no one ever checked. I went back to my desk and got to work. My 45 years of experience had taught me that every major project has a countermove. For every action, there is a legal and procedural reaction. She had destroyed my view of the woods. I decided I would give her a new view, something to look at from her million-dollar deck. Something she would have to look at every single day for the rest of her life in that house. I pulled out the original zoning maps for my property. I knew them by heart. My 50 acres were zoned rural residential, a designation that came with very few restrictions. While the surrounding HOA properties were choked with covenants, my land was a blank slate. I checked the county building codes. I checked the state regulations. And then I made a call to the Federal Communications Commission. I spent the next 2 weeks in a flurry of paperwork. I filed an application for an amateur radio operator's license. I passed the exam with a perfect score. As a licensed ham radio operator, I was now afforded certain federal protections, specifically the FCC's PRB1 rule, which preempts most local ordinances that would restrict the erection of amateur radio antennas. An HOA rule could not stop a federally regulated activity. Then I drew up the plans. It was a design I had used dozens of times in my career. A 195-foot, self-supporting, galvanized steel lattice tower. It was the maximum height I could build without requiring FAA lighting. It was an elegant, brutal piece of engineering, strong, stable, and designed to last for a century. It was, in its own way, as permanent as the pines had been. The location I chose was critical. Using David's survey map, I seated the tower base at a point on my property that was, by sheer coincidence, directly in the center of Carol Matheson's prized mountain view. It would be perfectly, immovably, and legally positioned to bisect her panorama of the sunset. I submitted the plans and permit applications to the county. They were flawless. Every setback was correct. Every structural calculation was included. Every environmental impact form was filled out. I was not asking for a variance or an exception. I was simply filing a plan for a structure that was, according to every applicable rule and statute, a permitted use for my property. The county issued the permit in 12 days. It was a simple, unassuming sheet of paper, but it was a weapon. It was a tangible, documented, legally binding permission slip for my revenge. I made a high-quality color copy and placed it in a weatherproof sleeve. The concrete trucks were scheduled for a Monday. But first, the survey crew had to return to stake out the foundation. That was the day Carol finally understood she was no longer in control. David and his crew arrived on a Thursday morning to drive the survey stakes for the 3 massive concrete piers that would form the tower's foundation. The stakes were simple wooden posts with bright pink flagging tape tied to their tops, but they were a declaration of intent. They were physical markers of the coming change. I was in my study when I saw Carol's car screech to a halt at the end of my driveway. She got out, her phone already pressed to her ear. She was shouting into it, gesticulating wildly toward David's crew. She didn't dare set foot on my property this time. She had learned that much, at least. She stood just on the other side of the invisible line. On the HOA's manicured street, a furious queen banished from a kingdom she thought she ruled. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up. A young deputy, his name tag read Miller, got out of the car. He looked calm, professional, and thoroughly unimpressed by the drama. This was clearly not the first time he had been called to a petty neighborhood dispute. Carol launched into her performance. Her voice was high and strained with synthetic panic. "Officer, thank God you're here, this man," she said, pointing at me as I walked down the driveway to meet them, "is building some kind of illegal industrial structure. It's a monstrosity. It's going to destroy our property values. He has no permit. You have to make them stop." Deputy Miller turned to me. His expression was neutral. "Sir, can you tell me what's going on here?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't engage with Carol's accusations. I simply handed him the weatherproof sleeve containing the county-issued building permit. "Good morning, Deputy," I said calmly. "My name is Arthur Vance. This is my property. I am a licensed amateur radio operator. This is the county-approved permit for the erection of my antenna tower. The survey crew is staking out the foundation as required by the permit." He took the sleeve and examined the document carefully. He read every line. He looked at the official stamp, the signature from the county planning director. He walked over to one of the survey stakes and compared the location to the site plan attached to the permit. Everything was in order, on paper. He walked back to Carol. "Mom," he said, his voice polite but firm, "the property owner has a valid permit for this construction. It appears to be a civil matter. There's nothing I can do." Carol's face went crimson. "A civil matter? He is destroying our community. That thing is a safety hazard. It's an eyesore. The HOA explicitly forbids this kind of structure." This was the moment I had been waiting for. I stepped forward slightly. "Deputy Miller," I said, making sure my voice was clear and audible for his body camera, which I could see was recording. "For the record, could you please note in your report that Mrs. Matheson is attempting to use the authority of the HOA to prevent a federally protected activity on my private property which is explicitly exempt from the HOA's architectural covenants. And could you also note that I have presented you with a valid, legally issued permit from the county?" The deputy's eyes flicked to me, and I saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps even appreciation. He recognized the language of someone building a legal case. He was no longer dealing with a simple squabble. He was now a witness to a formal statement of fact. "I can put that in my report, sir," he said. He turned back to Carol. Her face had gone from red to a pale, blotchy white. The word federal had clearly registered. Her blustering confidence began to evaporate, replaced by a dawning, horrified confusion. She had built her little empire on a flimsy foundation of bylaws and social pressure, and I had just brought in the full weight of county, state, and federal regulations. She was out of her depth, and she was just beginning to realize it. The deputy handed me back my permit. He gave Carol a final curt nod and returned to his car. As he drove away, Carol stood frozen on the street, staring at the pink-flagged stakes that marked the future grave of her scenic view. She looked small and powerless. The true turning point, however, came later that afternoon. I saw my neighbor, Mr. Henderson, walking tentatively up my driveway. He was a quiet, elderly man, a retired botanist who had lived here even longer than I had. Carol had terrorized him for years, fining him for the dandelions in his lawn and the unapproved species of roses in his garden. He clutched an old felt hat in his hands. "Arthur," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I saw the sheriff. I saw her face. Are you really doing it?" "I am, George," I said. He looked past me, toward the meadow, toward the field of stumps. A tear welled in his eye. "She killed them," he said. "Those were good trees. Old souls." He took a deep, shaky breath. "I have to tell you something I was afraid to before. She's a bully." He told me that the day before the trees were cut, he had been working in his garden, which bordered Carol's backyard. He had overheard her on her deck, hosting some friends for wine. He heard every word. He heard her laughing as she told them how she had finally found a way to get rid of those ugly, view-blocking pines. He heard her brag about how the fire safety report from her cousin was a stroke of genius, and how the old fool Vance, meaning me, would never know what hit him. She never once mentioned safety, Mr. Henderson said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and righteous anger. It was always about the view. Always, she said, and I quote, "By this time next week I'll have a clear view of the mountains for my sunset parties." I asked him if he would be willing to write that down, to sign his name to it in a formal affidavit. He looked at the survey stakes, then back at me, and his fear seemed to melt away, replaced by a hard resolve. "Yes," he said, his voice suddenly strong. "I will, Mr." Henderson's affidavit was more than just another piece of evidence. It was the voice of the community, the first crack in the wall of fear Carol had built, and he was not the last. 2 days later, I received an anonymous email. It was from a member of the HOA board. Let's call her Sarah. She had been on the board for a year and was disgusted by Carol's tyrannical behavior. She had voted against the tree removal, but Carol had pushed it through, claiming she had the authority to make an executive decision on matters of imminent safety. Attached to the email were the internal communications of the HOA board for the past month. It was a chain of emails that showed Carol explicitly lying to the other board members. She told them I had been notified and had agreed to the tree removal. She presented her cousin's fraudulent report as an independent, expert assessment. She dismissed another board member's suggestion to get a second opinion. It was a complete, documented record of her bad faith and deceit. The coalition was forming. The facts were assembling themselves. Carol, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet, made one last desperate move. She called an emergency meeting of the HOA board. Using her presidential authority, and with her allies on the board, she pushed through a new bylaw. It was a hasty, poorly written rule that banned any non-approved structure over 20 feet in height. It was specifically and obviously targeted at my tower. She had it passed and ratified in a single evening. The next morning, a notice of the new rule was taped to my front door. She thought she had checkmated me. She had no idea that a retroactively applied rule designed to block a federally protected activity was not only unenforceable, it was illegal. She had just handed my lawyer the final, perfect piece of evidence we needed to prove a pattern of targeted harassment. She had documented her own malice. The file was now complete. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The annual HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of chlorine from the nearby pool. It was usually a sparsely attended affair, a dull recitation of budgets and landscaping contracts. Tonight, it was standing room only. Word had spread. The tower, whose foundation had been poured the week before, was a tangible reality. The steel beams, delivered and stacked neatly on my property, were a promise of what was to come. The neighborhood was divided. On one side of the room sat Carol's contingent, the sycophants and beneficiaries of her reign. On the other side sat the residents who had been fined, harassed, and ignored for 2 years. Mr. Henderson sat in the front row, his back straight. Sarah, the disillusioned board member, sat with him. I sat with my lawyer, Ben, in the back. In front of Ben was a single, thick accordion file, not the original manila folder, but its final, weaponized form. The meeting began with the usual procedural nonsense. Then Carol, as president, moved to the main agenda item: community standards and enforcement. This was her stage. She stood at the podium, her voice quivering with practiced emotion. She painted a picture of a peaceful, harmonious community under siege. "Friends, neighbors," she began, her eyes sweeping the room. "We have built something special here at Eagle's Crest, a community of shared values, of beauty, of respect for one another. We have all invested our life savings to live here, to enjoy the peace and the stunning natural beauty." Her eyes flicked toward me. "But our community is being threatened. One individual has decided that his own selfish desires are more important than the good of the whole. He seeks to erect an industrial eyesore, a monstrous metal tower that will cast a shadow over our homes, endanger our children, and plummet our property values." She was good, I had to admit it. She played on their fears, their financial anxieties. She portrayed me as an outsider, a foreign agent of chaos. She spoke of safety, of falling ice in the winter, of the tower attracting lightning. It was all nonsense, but it was effective theater. Then she delivered what she thought was her killing blow. Fortunately, your board has taken decisive action. We have passed a new protective covenant. Bylaw 11.7, which I have copies of here, explicitly prohibits any structure over 20 feet. This tower is illegal. We have sent a notice of violation, and if construction proceeds, we will levy the maximum fines and seek a court injunction to have it torn down. We will not let one man destroy our paradise. She finished to a round of applause from her side of the room. She smiled, a triumphant, reptilian smile. She had laid out her case, her authority, her power. She thought she had won. She had no idea that she had just walked, with open eyes, directly into a perfectly designed and meticulously documented trap. Ben leaned over to me. "Showtime," he whispered. He stood up. "Madam President," he said, his voice calm and carrying easily through the suddenly silent room. "My name is Benjamin Carter. I am the legal counsel for Mr. Arthur Vance. Mr. Vance would like to address the board and the members of this community." Carol's smile faltered. The presence of a lawyer was not in her script. "This is a community meeting, not a courtroom," she snapped. "We are not taking legal statements." "That's fine," Ben said smoothly. "Mr. Vance is not here to make a legal statement. He is here, as a member of this association in good standing, to present some documents for the board's consideration. Documents that pertain directly to the matter you have just raised." Before she could object, I stood and walked to the front of the room. I was not carrying a thick file. I held only a small remote control for the projector that was aimed at the screen behind the podium. Ben had arranged it with the clubhouse manager earlier. I clicked the first button. The first image that appeared on the screen was David's survey map. It was large, clear, and color-coded. A thick red line marked my property boundary. Deep inside that red line, a series of 42 blue circles marked the exact location of each tree stump. I didn't say a word. I just let the image hang there, a silent, geometric refutation of any claim that this was a boundary dispute. I clicked again. The next image was a high-resolution photograph of a single page of the Eagles Crest HOA covenants and restrictions, the master document that had been filed with the county when the development was created. I had highlighted a single paragraph. Article 2, Section 3, Exempt Properties. It listed my specific property plat by its legal identification number and stated, in clear, unambiguous language, that it was exempt from all architectural and landscape restrictions contained herein. My property was not subject to her rules. It never had been. A low murmur went through the room. I clicked again. The screen now showed the fire safety assessment that Carol had provided. Beside it, I projected the business license for Gable's Lawn and Garden and a screenshot of Mark Gable's Facebook page, where he was proudly holding up a string of fish next to his smiling cousin, Carol Matheson. The murmur in the room grew louder. People were starting to connect the dots. This was the moment. I watched Carol's face. Her performative mask of concern and authority was beginning to crack. Her confident posture sagged. Her eyes, which had been sweeping the room to command her audience, were now locked on the screen, on the undeniable evidence of her nepotism and fraud. The mask did not just crack, it shattered. For a split second I saw her true face, the face of a petty tyrant, a cheat, caught in the glare of a spotlight she could not control. Her expression went from confident to blank, a complete void as her brain struggled to process the scale of her miscalculation. She was a performer whose stage had just collapsed from under her. I let the image linger for a full 30 seconds. Then I clicked again. Mr. Henderson's signed and notarized affidavit appeared on the screen. His damning quote about her desire for a clear view of the mountains for my sunset parties, highlighted in yellow. Mr. Henderson sat a little taller in his chair. Click. The email chain from Sarah, the board member, showing Carol lying to her own board. Sarah looked straight ahead, refusing to meet the shocked and betrayed looks from her fellow board members. Click. A copy of the check for $18,500 that the HOA had paid to the tree company. Beside it, a formal estimate from Dr. Annabelle Reed, the forensic arborist. Her report valued the destroyed heritage pines not at their timber value, but at their replacement and ecological value. The total was $1.4 million. A collective gasp went through the room. The applause for Carol from 20 minutes earlier seemed like a distant, foolish memory. For the final slide, I projected a copy of my county-issued permit for the tower. Beside it, I put up a page from the FCC's official website explaining PRB 1 and the federal preemption of local ordinances, including HOA rules regarding amateur radio antennas. I had highlighted the relevant passages. Her brand new bylaw, the one she had just brandished as her ultimate weapon, was legally meaningless. It was a blank cartridge. I turned off the projector. The room was utterly silent. I had not raised my voice. I had not accused or argued. I had simply presented the facts, the paper, the documentation. I had let the truth speak for itself. I walked back to my seat. Ben stood up. "As you can see," he said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence, "a significant error has been made. My client's property has been damaged. The HOA has been exposed to a tremendous liability based on what appears to be a fraudulent report commissioned by your president for personal benefit. Mr. Vance has until now attempted to resolve this quietly. That time has passed." He let that hang in the air. Then he looked at the other board members, the ones who had been deceived by Carol. "My client is formally demanding the immediate resignation of Carol Matheson as president and from the board. He is also informing you that a lawsuit will be filed tomorrow morning against the HOA for $1.4 million in damages and against Mrs. Matheson personally for fraud and willful destruction of property. We have also, as a courtesy, forwarded the fraudulent fire safety assessment to the State Attorney General's office for review." The collapse was total. Carol stood, speechless, her face a pale, waxy mask. Her allies, the ones who had applauded her, were now staring at their shoes, distancing themselves from her as if she were radioactive. Sarah stood up. "I call for a vote of no confidence in President Matheson and move for her immediate removal from the board," she said, her voice clear and strong. Another board member, a man who had been cowed by Carol for a year, immediately seconded the motion. The vote was a formality. It was nearly unanimous. Carol Matheson was stripped of her power in the same room where she had so confidently wielded it just minutes before. She gathered her papers, her hand shaking, and fled the room without another word. She didn't look at anyone. The Queen had been deposed. The reign was over. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The lawsuit, as Ben had promised, was filed the next morning. The HOA's insurance company took one look at the file Ben sent them. The survey, the fraudulent report, the emails, the affidavit, and immediately understood their position was indefensible. They weren't just facing a simple trespass claim. They were facing a case of documented, deliberate fraud committed by the president of the board. Their liability was enormous. They settled in less than a month. The HOA's policy had a $1 million limit for this kind of claim, which they paid out in full. Their lawyers also made it clear to the HOA board that the portion of the damages resulting from fraudulent activity was not covered by their directors' and officers' insurance. To cover the remaining $400,000 from my claim, plus my legal fees which they were also required to pay, the HOA had two choices: levy a massive special assessment on every single homeowner, or go after the person who had committed the fraud. The new board, with Sarah now acting as president, chose the latter. They sued Carol and her husband personally for the remainder. Faced with financial ruin, the Mathesons sold their house, the one with the now perfect view of my gleaming, half-constructed tower, at a fire sale price, and left the community in disgrace. I never saw her again. On paper, her entire 2-year campaign to improve her view had resulted in her public humiliation, her financial devastation, and the permanent, legal installation of a 195-foot steel monument to her own hubris. The community began to heal. The first act of the new board was to rescind every fine Carol had ever levied. They went through the books, and checks were mailed out to dozens of residents, refunding the money they had paid for their coiled garden hoses and their non-compliant trash cans. The oppressive atmosphere of judgment and petty tyranny lifted. People started talking to each other again. Mr. Henderson began a community garden on a patch of unused common land. The beige conformity of Eagle's Crest began to give way to a little bit of life. The tower was completed in the fall. It was a magnificent structure in its own way. A feat of engineering, of precise angles and load-bearing steel, soaring into the sky. It was perfectly plumb, perfectly stable, and perfectly legal. I never actually used it for amateur radio. Its purpose was not communication. Its purpose was to be a statement, a permanent physical record of events. Sometimes in the evening, I sit on my back porch with a cup of tea and look at it. It stands just where the pines used to be, its clean, geometric lines a stark contrast to the organic wildness of the forest that still surrounds it. It does not block my view. It has become my view. It is not as beautiful as the trees Eleanor loved. Nothing could be. The wound of their loss will never fully heal. But the tower is not about beauty. It is about order. It is about the principle that rules, real rules, the ones based on laws and facts and verifiable truths, must prevail over the arbitrary whims of those who seek power for its own sake. I think about ownership and what it really means. Carol thought she owned the view. She believed her financial investment in her house entitled her to control what lay beyond her property line. She was wrong. You can own land, but you cannot own a vista. You cannot own the sunset. My pines were not hers to take, and the sky was not hers to keep clear. I own my 50 acres, but I am also just a steward, a temporary caretaker for a piece of land that was here long before me, and will be here long after. The trees were part of that stewardship. The tower is now too. It is a strange inheritance. Last week, Mr. Henderson brought me a small seedling in a pot. It was a longleaf pine, grown from a cone he had collected from the forest floor months before the destruction. "A new start," he said, handing it to me. We walked together out to the edge of the meadow, not far from the base of the tower, and we found a good spot, a place with plenty of sun. I dug the hole and he placed the young tree in the earth. It is small and fragile, but it is alive. It will be 100 years before it reaches the height of its fallen brethren. I will not live to see it, but it is there. Its roots are in the soil. It is a testament not to what was lost, but to what endures. The manila folder sits on the shelf in my study. It is thick and heavy with the weight of receipts, letters, and reports. It is a complete story, a closed case, every action documented, every consequence recorded. It is a quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is not a loud voice or a position of authority. Sometimes it is just a piece of paper and the patience to know what to do with it. The tower stands guard, the seedling grows, and the view from my porch is one of quiet, ordered, and profound satisfaction. It is the view of peace, a peace that was violated and then, methodically and completely restored.